All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. World War II, Lecture 4. Today we are going to try and cover 11 slides. I skipped 2 last time, so I've added them to this one. We will discuss Japanese aggression, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declaring war, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Stalingrad in Russia. We'll discuss the war in North Africa. Italy surrendering, the D-Day invasion, which you're already experts about, the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the firebombing of Dresden, which is in Germany. So you guys are becoming quite the World War II scholars. I guess I should start the PowerPoint. Sorry about that. All right, so here we go. Japanese aggression. So, and you can see from this map on the left-hand side here that these are all the locations of Japanese forces. So the Japanese had invaded Korea, they'd invaded China, Manchuria, they'd invaded the Chinese Expeditionary Army, the mainland of China here, they've invaded Hong Kong, they've sent a navy all the way down through the Gilbert Islands, through the Solomon Islands, through New Guinea, through Java, Sumatra, and into Burma. And when you study World War II again in the 11th grade, you'll get a much bigger view of the war in the Pacific, as it is called. So the land war on Europe got all the European powers' attention away from protecting their colonies in East Asia. And Japan and their emperor here, Hideko Tojo, takes advantage of this, and he continues a policy of imperialist expansion. So Japan wants to start taking over its own colonies. In 1940, Japan launches an initiative known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming it would free the region from European domination. In reality, Japan just really wanted to put its own colonial rule in charge of that of the Europeans. So President Roosevelt had been alarmed by the Japanese expansion in East Asia and in the Pacific, and he takes some moves to slow down Japan's efforts. In 1940, he ended the sales of steel and scrap iron to Japan. After Japan conquers French Indochina in 1941, Roosevelt cuts off oil shipments to Japan and freezes Japanese assets in U.S. banks. Both countries at this time realize they're heading down the path to war. Japanese and American diplomats have meetings in 1941 trying to find a way to avoid conflict. Behind the scenes, however, Japan was already planning an attack. General Hideko Tojo, in your picture here, advocated going to war with the U.S. He becomes the Japanese prime minister in October of 1940. And in late November, Japan begins moving a fleet across the Pacific toward Hawaii. So, and you can't really see it on this side, but Hawaii is this way. Hawaii is, I guess, east of Japan. So, in the next slide, we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor. And this is a beautiful, this does not look like a real photo. This is an oil painting. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At the same time, the base held nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. 2 hours after the attack began, 18 American ships had been sunk, including 8 battleships. This destroyed America's naval capability. The attack also left about 2,400, more than 2,400 Americans dead, with another 1,000 wounded. So, and I'm sure you can all figure out that the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt addresses Congress and asks for a declaration of war with Japan. This was immediately approved, and you can see in your picture here, this is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signing the declaration of war against Japan. In a speech to Congress, Roosevelt said that December 7th, 1941, would be remembered as a date which would live in infamy. Since Japan was a member of the Tripartite Pact, with Germany then declared war on the United States, America reciprocated and declared war on Germany on December 11th. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill rejoices because the U.S. have entered World War II. To have the United States on our side was to me the greatest joy. Now, at this very moment, I knew the United States was in the war up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. Hitler's fate was sealed, Mussolini's fate was sealed, and as for the Japanese, they would be ground down into powder. Harsh words from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. So, in 1942, as the U.S. gets into the war, you're going to see a series of events. This is the U.S. Yorktown getting a direct bomb hitting it during the Battle of Midway. But most of these events are going to change the tide of the war in favor of the Allied powers, which is the United States, France, England, and Russia. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States begins an island-hopping campaign to strike back against Japan. General Douglas MacArthur led the ground troops, while Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the naval forces. Early in the summer of 1942, the Japanese set up a plan to draw in American ships to the island of Midway and ambush them there. The U.S. had decoded secret messages that revealed the Japanese plan. So the U.S. decides to set up an ambush of its own. Admiral Nimitz would have his carriers ready and waiting at Midway for the Japanese. Though both sides sustained heavy losses in the ensuing battle, Japan suffers far more than the U.S. Japan loses 4 aircraft carriers, and after this decisive U.S. naval victory, the remainder of the Japanese fleet has to retreat. The United States had claimed the offensive and begins to act more aggressively to secure island after island in the Pacific. And I don't know if you guys have watched it. There's a wonderful HBO series called the one about the war in Europe, World War II, a mini-series done by HBO. The one that's about the European war is called The Band of Brothers, based on a book by famous historian Stephen Ambrose. The one that's about the war against the Japanese is called The Pacific. And those, you can get them on HBO to go. You can probably rent them on Netflix. They're 8 to 10 episodes of really, really good television, and it will give you some great insight as to what those battles were really like. So on our next slide, we go to Russia, and this is the Battle of Stalingrad, which I believe was primarily a tank battle. Hitler ordered his troops to attack Stalingrad in August of 1942. There is intensive house-to-house fighting. The Germans slowly occupy most of the city. In November, the Soviets counterattack and surround the German army. As supplies run low and the harsh, cold Russian winter sets in, the German army suffered a low attrition, meaning people are deserting. Thousands of troops are either vanishing, dying of the cold and starvation, and they're also running out of ammunition. So the Germans are forced to surrender in Russia in January 1943. And the human toll of this battle is just enormous. An estimated 500,000 Russians die, along with 150,000 Germans. So this battle marks a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Just as in the Pacific, the Axis armies were on the defensive, and the Axis, of course, is Germany, Japan, and the Italy, and the Allied armies are now on the offensive. The Soviet Union is the same as the Russians, and so the Russian troops are pushing the Germans out of Russia back towards Germany in the west. And this was a huge battle that Germany lost, and really marks the beginning of the end of the war. Now, also in North Africa, you can see the countries of Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Egypt. Mussolini had ordered his North African army to move against the British in Egypt. This happened in 1940. And after the initial success, the Italians were forced back by an attacking British army. This time, the Italian troops are totally routed, just destroyed. In response, Hitler sends General Erwin Rommel to command a new tank corps and take Egypt from the British. On November 4th, 1942, after months of back and forth fighting, the British Army stopped the Germans at El Alamein, E-L space A-L-A-M-E-I-N, in Egypt. Where is it? It's El Alamein, right here in Egypt. By March of 1943, the Allies had North Africa totally under control, and they begin to plan for an invasion of Sicily, which is over here in Italy. This little boot right here is known as Italy. So Italy is very close to North Africa, and they're going to be retreating and heading back to Italy. So the goal was to regain control of much of the Mediterranean and to force Hitler to redirect a large number of his troops to the Western Front, which eases the fighting on the Eastern Front for the Russians. So the Allies, basing their operations in North Africa, invaded and captured Sicily in the summer of 1943, forcing Mussolini out of power and really ending the war for the Italians. In fact, on your next slide, you have Italy surrenders. So, in 1943, Mussolini is removed from office by the fascist Grand Council. He was put in prison, but Hitler has him rescued, and Hitler sets him up as the head of the Italian government in German-occupied northern Italy. On June 4th, 1944, the Allies enter Rome. They continue to push north, and they gain control of all of Italy by April 1945. While trying to escape to Switzerland, Mussolini is captured by Italian partisans and executed. With a Soviet victory almost certain in the east and Italy's surrender in the west, the Allies begin to prepare for the invasion of France. They hope that once they secure France, they could push forward into Germany from two fronts and once again crush the Nazis. And you guys are all experts in how the U.S. is going to invade France. It is D-Day. And we've watched a couple videos on that. We know that the Allies carefully planned the invasion of Europe. The Germans suspected an invasion was imminent, so they had heavily fortified the entire French coast, because they did not know where the invasion would take place. On June 6, 1944, combined British and American forces land on the beaches of Normandy in what would be the greatest naval invasion in history. Within 100 days, more than 2 million troops and 500,000 vehicles were making their way inland. By late July, the Allies, led by General George Patton, had pushed past the German defenses. The invasion was called Operation Overlord, and it was successful, although it had the huge cost of 10,000 Allied casualties. In the document we read, it said it was 73,000 Allied casualties, so you can tell there's always confusion over how many people were actually injured, how many people are killed. The German losses were estimated between 4,000 and 9,000 soldiers. So the D in D-Day has no significance. It simply refers to day, as in the first day of this particular operation. And here you see the big ships coming in, opening up, and letting the little landing craft down, the trucks and the tanks. And here you see the troops waiting ashore at Normandy. And we saw the first few minutes of Saving Private Ryan, which captures that in all of its brutal glory. And there's also a great book called The Flags of Our Fathers, which many of you will read next year, about the lifting of the flag at Iwo Jima, the war in the Pacific. There's been a lot of great movies about World War II, and there continue to be new ones made every year. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for paying attention. I hope you took good notes, and I will see you tomorrow.